Okay. All right. Can everybody see my my PowerPoint? Looks good. You don't see you see the actual slide, not the notes and stuff. Okay, good. Yeah, so I'm Bryant Baker. I know a lot of you. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. I love any opportunity I get to kind of nerd out about plants and post-fire regrowth. And so that's really what I'm going to focus on. I work on a lot of different things at Los Padres Forest Watch, but one of the things that I do, I feel like on the side, but also as sort of, I guess, part of my work is I take literally tens of thousands of photos every year. A lot of it focused on post-fire environments in Santa Barbara County and just in general in the region. So I'm gonna focus today on regrowth in the Santa Barbara front country. So you're going to see mostly photos from the cave fire, the 2019 cave fire, which I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with. But you also see some other ones from the Thomas fire and the Whittier fire as well. And I realize this is maybe a little bit of a change of pace. We were just talking a lot about like what do we do before fire, all this like sort of pre-fire work. But I guess one of the things I want to convey here is just how interesting post-fire environments are, especially in Chaparral, and maybe just give you something interesting and fun to look at that you're not maybe always getting to see. So of course, we're always, I think we're all familiar with what this area looks like in its mature stage. You know, it's mostly dominated by chaparral. The San Ynez Mountains are almost entirely chaparral dominated, especially on the south slopes. On the north facing slopes, you do start to get into some oak woodland, and you see that in the canyons on the south slopes as well. But yeah, it's mostly chaparral. It's mostly dominated by chamise and manzanita, different species of ceanothus, and a bunch of other different shrub species. And I think it is amazing in its sort of mature state. It's quite an interesting ecosystem. I'm going to admit somebody into the waiting room here. I just got a notification. Sorry. Let's see here. It's a fascinating ecosystem, and I know a lot of you are really familiar with it. But I want to focus on what happens in the weeks and months and years after this ecosystem burns. And so again, I'm going to focus mostly on the cave fire.
You said you don't like them.
Yep. If everyone could mute, I think we're getting some. Is everyone else hearing that?
So am I getting off on the 23?
I think it's Gordon. Gordon, can you mute yourself, please?
I got it. I can mute him. I have co-host abilities. So this is the cave fire area, and I like this photo because it kind of shows this sort of dichotomy between sort of mature chaparral and really recently burned. This is just 2 months after the cave fire, and you can see where the fire stopped in a couple of areas here. So I think this is an interesting view of what it looks like right before the fire and right after. This is just within a couple weeks of the fire. I went up there and got some photos, and it's kind of otherworldly. And I'm sure a lot of you have been in these immediate post-fire environments. And for, I think, the average person who's not very familiar with wildfire or, you know, fire ecology, I think they just, they look at this and think, you know, oh, this is completely devastated. This is destroyed. This is like ecologically catastrophic. And I totally understand why people think that. I mean, just look at it. It looks, it doesn't look great. And, you know, it's hard to imagine when you're standing out in this area, you know, a week after a fire. It's hard to imagine what it's going to be like in just a few months or in a few years. And I remember with the Alisol fire, I thought this was the most interesting tweet of that whole fire. This is former governor of Wisconsin, Scott Walker. I remember seeing this that year. He said that the area around the Reagan Ranch looked like the Darklands from The Lion King. And I thought that was so fascinating, you know, like the perspective of somebody, especially who's not in this region and who's probably not very familiar with how fires work here. And I think, you know, as a lot of us know, this is the norm for chaparral. It's high intensity fire. It burns most of the vegetation. You're usually only left with some stems and stumps. But this is how this ecosystem looks after fire. This is, for all intents and purposes, this is natural, right? But what we forget, and what I think the average person is not as familiar with, is this sort of the stages of regrowth that happen afterward, and that the ecosystem, while it looks completely different right after a fire, a lot of what was there before the fire is still there. It's just kind of under the surface, and I think this is a really amazing process to watch unfold. And so this is one of my favorite images I've put together. I took the same spot, and I've been taking a photo at the same spot for the last couple of years now. I'll just show you the first 17 months of regrowth. So what you're seeing is the same spot, just sort of a different slice of it from different periods after the fire. And so you can see there's almost like these really distinctive phases that occur. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Just in the cave fire, just in the first year, I documented 80 plus plant species from 63 different genera, 36 different families. So incredible diversity that occurs right after wildfire and chaparral. And what I like to try to teach with these presentations, it's not just to look at pretty photos, but it's also to learn about how is it that plants actually cope with fire, right? I just said that, that image where it looks like the darklands or the shadowlands from the Lion King, like that's the norm, that's natural. Well, how do plants deal with this, right? So I'm going to talk about some different fire response strategies that plants employ. And the first one are the obligate resprouters. So I should preface this with, all plants, they start out as a seed at the beginning of their life, right? They start from seed and then they grow. What I'm talking about here is just specifically what happens after a fire. How do plants repopulate an area? What happens in terms of their reproductive cycle? So just think about this in terms of how are these plants responding to fire? So the obligate resprouters, they are plants where you have adults, mature adults that are in the area before it burns. The fire comes through. Usually those adults survive, but if there are any seedlings and if there's any seed that hasn't germinated in that area, usually those are destroyed by the fire. They're killed. So another way to put this is that after a fire, the only way that these plants really reclaim their space in those first months and couple of years is by resprouting. They don't come up from seed. And the magic behind this is often it's a burl, which is sort of this either fully buried or partially buried enlarged mass at the base of their stems that have a bunch of adventitious buds. And so they're protected from all this wood and being partly buried. They're somewhat protected by from the fire, from the heat, from the flames. And so you can get resprouting that occurs. And it's usually quite soon after the fire, especially once you start getting into the wet season. But this is toyon, very common species in the area. This is just 3 months after the fire. If you came 1 week after the fire, you would assume that this plant was completely dead. But no, it's still alive. Its root system is there pretty much untouched, and it is putting up new growth within just a few months. And then this is just 1 month later. You can see it's really rapid growth. So with obligate resprouters, with any resprouters, they're able to put up a lot of new plant material quite quickly after a fire, and that helps them reclaim that space that they were occupying before the fire. It usually takes about 2 years, I would say, before you start seeing these species start to produce fruits again and start putting out seed again. I've been in quite a few post-fire areas in chaparral, and I've only ever seen toyon start fruiting in the second growing season after the fire. So you usually don't see it in that first season. California Bay laurel, another really common plant, especially on the north-facing slopes the San Ynez Mountains and in shadier areas, moister areas. This plant I think it puts up more new plant growth from resprouting from its basal burls than any other plant in terms of like how the rate at which this occurs. You can just see this this is from the Whittier fire. This is my partner Gabby. She's average height, and you can see this is about 4 years after the fire. The bay laurel regrowth is incredible. I mean, it blows my mind every time I see it. And they just put up more, they put out more biomass than pretty much any other species after a fire. Coast live oak is a great example, and several other oaks of this other form of obligate resprouters where they can't, a lot of them can resprout from their base, and they will do that, but they're also able to do something called epicormic sprouting. So they'll actually sprout new branches from these burned big stems and branches. So this is epicormic sprouting 4 months after the cave fire occurred. This is a coast live oak, and you can see this can help these oaks especially, they're just kind of famous for this ability, but they can be burned, scorched head to toe, completely lose their canopy in the fire. If I sometimes worry that private landowners might think, oh, this tree died, I should probably cut it, so it doesn't fall. And if you don't give it a few months to see if it starts epicomically sprouting, you might kill the tree while it's still alive, right? So they can redevelop their canopies. I've seen entire oak woodlands where they burned a high severity fire, and you would be hard pressed to find a living leaf in them, and then they completely redevelop that canopy structure, which is pretty cool. Another one that people don't often think about in terms of, its resprouting ability is chaparral yucca. This is a really cool species. I think we're probably all familiar with it, but it looks like this is something that you'll see in the really early post-fire period, like a few months after the fire. They look like crispy pineapples, like someone just took a pineapple and whole and then threw it on the grill. That's what it reminds me of. And I can't get enough of it. So I have hundreds of photos of this plant, but here's just a few. But they can resprout pretty well. They'll put up new growth fairly quickly after fire. This is just 2 months after the fire. You can see that it's putting up some new leaves. And this was in an area that, again, burned really intensely. So you would think that plant wouldn't have survived, but it did. Okay, so the real star, I think, of the early post-fire period in chaparral, especially in the Sand Ynez Mountains, is wild cucumber. It is fascinating. The first time I really got to observe this, it just kind of blew me away, and I still am quite enamored with this plant. We have a couple species that grow in this area. They look really similar, but you can see these in mature chaparral. They will they grow from this really big underground tuber. I mean, the thing is huge. I should have included a photo. I have one where I'm like holding one that I found on a road cut that had fallen down to the road. And it's like bigger than my head by a long shot. And I've been told I have a pretty big head. So it has this underground tuber, right? And it is completely protected from the fire. I mean, it's like feet down into the soil. And usually when it comes up, each spring, it has to deal with this, intense canopy from the chaparral. It has to sort of twine its way up to the top of these shrubs. But when a fire occurs, it has like free reign. It is one of the very first things that comes up. I mean, you can start to see it within just a few weeks after the fire starting to, poke up out of the ground. And it then starts to just put out tendrils all over the surface, and it can take up huge swaths of this post-fire area. And what it ends up looking like, it looks like all of this. I mean, most of what you're seeing is wild cucumber. And this is, again, pretty early in this post-fire period. So it is putting out a lot of growth. It is the very first thing that I've seen that actually flowers right after the fire. So it's also attracting pollinators quite early in this process. But it's also helping, it helps with reducing erosion. It helps with interception. When rain falls, it's not just hitting bare soil. It has to go through these leaves and tendrils first. But it is it's a fascinating thing. And you don't want to eat this. So people always ask if you can eat wild cucumber. It is not edible. I just wanted to point that out, but it has really cool spiky fruits. Okay, now the opposite version of the obligate resprouter are the obligate seeders. These are plants that cannot resprout, but they can come up from seed, and that's the only way that they really repopulate an area after a fire. So with this case, all the adult plants are usually killed in the fire, and then they have this big dormant seed bank that has sometimes been sitting there for many decades since the last fire, and it is stimulated or enhanced, the germination by these different fire cues like high heat or smoke, chemicals from charred wood, a combination of those things, and it can be a pretty complex process. And so I think a couple of species of ceanothus are really good examples of this. In the Santa Barbara front country, it's mostly big pod ceanothus. As you get into the back country a little bit, it's more buckbrush or wedge leaf ceanothus, they're very similar species, but big pod ceanothus in the front country is responsible for these big, lovely ceanothus blooms that we get in February and March, that, like the hillsides will just be white. But what you usually see is the dead stump. So this is an adult that was probably pretty large, and you can tell it's ceanothus. They tend to usually completely burn up. You don't see them. You don't always see their stems remaining, and when they do burn up like this, they often have these like sharp points. I don't know why this is. It's just an observation. I thought this was pretty cool. So these are the stumps. So this was clearly an area that was dominated by mature big pod ceanothus, and then you have a bunch of seedlings coming up, but you won't see any resprouting around this. And in the first few months after the fire, usually you'll see like hundreds of seedlings, especially in areas that were pretty heavily dominated by these obligate cedars. You'll see hundreds of seedlings per square meter. And it's really cool to see. And over time, it doesn't take very long, but a lot of those seedlings will die, and that's just the normal part of the process. It's kind of like a self-thinning process, but a lot of them will survive. And this is a couple months after the fire. You can see there's a lot of seedling dieback here, and a good chunk of those will survive, though, that initial sort of dieback period. And if you sort of look at the trajectory, so we can look at the Hezzaceta fire area, which is very similar to the cave fire area. This is 11 years after the fire, and this is all big pod ceanothus. And so this would have looked very, very similar to those first couple of photos I just showed. And this is what it looks like about a decade later. And so that's what we can expect to see in several areas in the cave fire. Very dense growth here, where every single one of these came up from a single seed that in this case was germinated from high heat. And not all of these will survive. In fact, most of them will not survive, and as you get more and more mature. So this is about 80 years after a fire. This is also in the Santa Ynez Mountains, and this is in the this is like an understory has basically developed now. You have really thick leaf litter, but you can see that where you started with hundreds of seedlings per square meter, now you only have just a couple plants that survive into the long term. So this is the obligate cedars are probably they're the primary reason I would say that we're all concerned about areas reburning too soon after the previous fire. This is just a small example area. This was an area that burned in the Hezzaceta fire, and then it burned again in this little patch in the Thomas fire. And this is 3 years after the Thomas fire. So this is around the same time that you've seen a lot of the photos I just showed from the cave fire. This is either around the same time or after that period, right? So this is 3 years out, and you just will not find like a single seedling here, a big pod ceanothus seedling. You can see all of these ones that died, and the reason this is because they just hadn't had a chance to grow to maturity since the Hezzaceta fire and start producing seed again. And then it's not just that they can grow to maturity and start producing seed; they also need a lot of time to build that seed bank back up so that it's ready for the next fire. There's some other things that need to happen too. But this is an example. And so the reason this is a concern is obviously we're now 3 years out and there's still a lot of bare soil. Eventually, you'll start to see these invasive grasses start to take hold in here, especially along trails and where people are tracking in non-native seed. Manzanita is another example, a genus that has a lot of obligate cedars in it. The main one in our area being bigberry manzanita, which is one of the most common manzanitas in our region. You'll see these mature plants again die in the fire, and then they come up from seed that is surrounding this area. This is about 16 months after the fire. Very slow growing in this early period. So again, the resprouting plants, they grow they resprout and they put out a lot of growth very quickly. The ones that are coming up from seed, not as much. Now, there's this sort of there's this group of plants, and this is a lot of them fall into this group where they can do both. They can resprout after the fire, and they'll come up from seed, and usually that seed bank is germinating in response to fire, or it's enhanced by the fire. Chemise is probably the best example, but there are definitely some manzanitas that fall into this category, and ceanothus as well. This is transverse range manzanita. So you can see that's got that really nice burl here. And this is just a few months after the fire, and you can just see the little resprout starting to come up. And this is a few months later, not the same individual. Sometimes I have a hard time finding the plant I took a photo of, months before. But this is a really similar one. You can see it's putting out a lot of new growth. Again, chemise, probably the best example of this, also like the most common native shrub west of the Sierra Nevada. I don't see anything else do quite what it does. So it puts up tons of growth very quickly from its burls, but it also just has a huge amount of seedlings that will come up in that early post-fire period. That's what you're seeing here. These are all chemise seedlings. It's pretty cool to see. I also just really like chemise because it makes for some interesting photos where if you look kind of straight down on it, you have that nadir view. You can get this really nice fairy ring of growth around the burl, which is pretty cool. Greenbark ceanothus is a great example of probably the primary example of a ceanothus species in our region that is a facultative cedar. So this is what this individual looked like 1 week after the fire. Again, you would think there's no way that this plant survived. It looks completely burned to a crisp. It looks like it has just turned into charcoal. But sure enough, 4 months later, it has put out a lot of new growth. And then if you were to walk around here, you'd see a lot of seedlings as well. This is the same plant as well. This is about 2.5 years later. So you can see it is doing really well. Again, don't judge these plants by what they look like 1 week after the fire. Give them a little time and they might surprise you. Another one that I just have to mention, because for the longest time, I thought bush poppy was an obligate cedar, and just you don't really see it resprouting much. But in the cave fire, I actually found a lot of individuals that were resprouting. So this is a better described as a facultative cedar. And this is its seedling back here. They have really cool seedlings that look kind of like Matilaha poppy seedlings. This is it resprouting. So definitely top killed stem here. And this is that resprouting growth. Bush poppy is another one too that I would say there's in the second growing season and on into probably like the 10th growing season after the fire. It can be visually dominating in terms of it just really can cover the area quite a bit, and it's got a lot of big showy yellow flowers. And so like in the Thomas fire in Ventura County, especially, there's some areas where it seems like the only thing that is growing is bush poppy, and it's not. There are a lot of other plants growing there. It tends to sort of dominate that scene. The other neat thing about a lot of these plants, mainly ceanothus, bush poppy, and manzanitas, is that you will often find them coming up from seed in these clusters. And so with manzanitas especially, it's mostly from rodent caching. So you've got rodents that are actually burying these piles of seed. And with manzanitas, it's really nice because what it's doing is it's keeping them from getting burned, because the manzanita seeds don't need high heat to germinate like the ceanothus. So they can actually be destroyed by the fire fairly easily. So they need chemicals from smoke mainly. And so it's just deep enough that they get buried, that they're not destroyed by the fire, but not too deep that they're not also getting that chemical stimulation from smoke. Ceanothus, I'm not entirely sure what's caching ceanothus seeds. It might be rodents as well. There's not as much known about that. Bush poppy, the the best idea we have is that it's ants that are caching these, and they're actually able to eat part of the seed without killing the seed. And so that's something you'll see a lot of these bush poppy clusters. Now we can sort of scale back, and this is a drone view from right before the big rains happened earlier. So I was just out there a couple months ago, or a month ago, and you can really see everything on display that I just showed you. So you've got these are greenbark ceanothus. They have this sort of yellowish green color. They've all resprouted. So these are definitely some facultative cedars over here. You've got toyon resprouting here and here. These are obligate resprouters again. You've got chamise really dominating this area, chamise and manzanita. This is an area kind of poor soil, very rocky, very like decomposed sandstone. And they're doing really well here. Obviously not as much growth as quickly as some of these other areas, and that just has to do with soil conditions. You've got some interior live oak. Those are all obligate resprouters. They're resprouting from their base. And then this sort of interstitial spaces here are completely filled with mostly ceanothus in this case, a lot of bush poppy too, but a lot of that obligate cedar, big pod ceanothus and other species or two. So it's pretty cool to see this from the air. I was really nerding out while I was flying my drone over this. Maybe others don't find it quite as fascinating, but it's so cool to see. The last group I will talk about in terms of fire response strategy or fire followers. These are the really fun ones to look at. I think people get really excited about these. You tend to only see these in recently burned areas. Some you definitely will see outside of recently burned areas, but like where you see them the most is right after a fire. Typically, they have a large dormant seed bank. It's either completely dormant or it's partially dormant, and then it's enhanced or cued by all these different things like heat or smoke or chemicals and charred wood. And typically you don't see them last very long on the landscape. So it just takes a few years and then they start to disappear. In the cave fire, I would say the one that was really, really easy to find was giant flowered Phacelia. So it has these sort of humble beginnings, as all of these do. These seedlings that I think some people might walk through and think they're like weeds or something, but this is giant flowered Phacelia starting to come up. This is just 5 months after the fire. So it's just a few months later, and they they're super, they can get really big, quite tall for a forb, big broad leaves and just massive, beautiful flowers that attract tons of pollinators, and they can really cover the area. In the cave fire, they were absolutely sort of dominating in terms of fire followers in a lot of areas. And so there was sort of this distinctive phase in that first growing season where, if you thought about it from a visual perspective, there was this Phacelia phase that was really dominant. This is another cool photo where it's the same image, and I've split it between 1 week and 5 months. And so a lot of these stems too, these almost all of these have resprouted. It's a few different resprouting species, but look at all the giant flowered Phacelia that sort of fills in the space between. Really neat and super important for attracting wildlife back into the area. Another one that is one you don't get to see very often as you leave our region, but you'll see it in the Santa Monica Mountains, and then you'll see it in the San Ynez Mountains. And those are sort of two really key places to view this species. And you will only see it after fire. This is white eardrops, beautiful, beautiful plant, really fascinating flowers, also smells wonderful. Cool plant. You'll see it growing definitely in the first growing season, but it just goes crazy in that second growing season. And I saw this in the Whittier fire too. In fact, the Whittier fire is a good example of this species just disappears by the third or fourth growing season. So this is in the Whittier fire. This is about 3 years after the fire, and all of these are dead white eardrops. This is normal. This is a normal part of the process. It had 2 really good years of life. It lived it up, put out a lot of seed, and then it dies. And then you don't see it again until the next fire, as long as, it's been long enough until the next fire. So it's pretty neat. Fire poppy is another one that I think people get really excited about. I have a hard time finding this one. I think it has a really short bloom window, and so it's difficult to catch when it's blooming. But I was going out here like every week for that first year, and I found a little patch. And so really beautiful member of the poppy family that you pretty much only see after a fire. Another one that's related to Phacelia, whispering bells, cool plant. Again, you just don't see it, but except in those first few years after the fire. One that I guess you could call a fire follower, but I wouldn't say it's like strictly a fire follower. It just seems to do really well after fire. This is Fremont star lily, a super poisonous plant, but also really beautiful plant in the lily family. And it spends most of its life underground, just not doing a whole lot, just kind of living its life like a lot of lilies do. And then after the fire, it just has a wonderful time. It has really gorgeous flowers. Another one that this is really important from these like informal post-fire phases is morning glory. So it is one of the very first seedlings that you'll see after the fire. They are pretty nondescript, but this is a morning glory seedling 1 week after the fire. And this is what it looks like. This is 17 months post-fire, and these will stick around for quite some time. They will grow on the dead stems. They'll just grow on the ground. They'll grow on the new plants that are coming up. They're not invasive. They're not harming the plant. They're not parasitic or anything. Some people, I had some folks visiting from Colorado who were really interested in post-fire ecology, and they said that they have an invasive species of bindweed. It looks really similar to our native morning glory here, that they'll see in post-fire areas, and that really freaks them out. And so we do have some invasive bindweed, but this is all native morning glory. What I love about morning glory is that it provides sort of two phases. One is that like white phase where it's got a lot of flowers and it's really dominating the scene in terms of flowers. But then it also goes through this like rusty red phase every fall, basically the end of the dry season, into the winter a little bit. It just turns brown. It kind of goes dormant, and it looks like everything is dying. And so if you're not used to seeing this, if you're, if it's someone who's new to sort of following an area as it regrows after fire, this could really freak them out. If you like go in November in that first year after the fire, it can look really, really scary. Like, oh God, all the plants are dying. This is really bad. And this is just the morning glory sort of going into its dormant state for a few months. And it's really consistent in the San Ynez Mountains. This is in the Whittier fire about 2 years after the fire. You can see a lot more of those resprouters. There's been a lot more growth in that 2 year period, but you can still see a lot of that morning glory. And what's cool, I actually was just looking at some Gap Fire satellite imagery. And so a lot of you probably remember the Gap Fire in 2008. This is 2 years after the fire. This is a satellite image, and you can. I think this is the playground here, and you can really see, you can see the morning glory in the satellite imagery, which is pretty neat. While it's in that red phase. Okay, I just want to mention nitrogen fixers because they're super important from an ecological perspective in these post-fire environments. There are a lot of them, and most of them are legumes, but a couple of them are not, and they're quite unusual. Birchleaf mountain mahogany, very common native shrub in the San Ynez Mountains. It is capable of forming this relationship with certain types of bacteria that can basically take atmospheric nitrogen, which is inert and not usable by plants, and then those bacteria convert it into something that is usable by plants, and the plant kind of gets some of that. The bacteria get these nice root nodules that they get to live in, and then as the plant loses leaves or loses pieces of it, a lot of that nitrogen goes back into the soil, and then other plants get to utilize it. The reason this is important is because nitrogen volatilizes with the fire, and so this is very important from a nutrient cycling perspective. These nitrogen fixers, ceanothus is another one that can have this relationship with these bacteria, which is unusual. This is in the rose family, and this is in the buckthorn family. It's unique in those families. That it's not something that you would typically see. The family though that gets all the attention when you talk about nitrogen fixation is the legumes, and you get a lot of native legumes after fire in this area, a lot from the same genus. This is all from the Acmaspon genus. Deerweed, probably the best known example, but also like coastal lotus and chaparral lotus, really wonderful species, really cool flowers that attract a lot of pollinators, but they put out a lot of growth, and then they will also lose a lot of plant material that then decomposes and puts nitrogen back in the soil in a form that other plants can use. Lupins fall in this category as well. There's some really cool lupins that you'll see after the fire. Stinging lupin is one that you see predominantly in post-fire areas, and I saw a lot of that in the cave fire area. Not one you want to touch very much, but it's pretty neat. Okay, so we're almost at the end here. I just I wanted to show you the sort of beauty of the post-fire environment, like in this sort of crazy slide that took me way longer than it should have to put together. Just look at all of the color variation, that you get from wildflowers, from resprouting shrubs, from fruits. It can be really, really astounding. And so I would say the chaparral is probably at its most colorful in that first couple of years after the fire, if you're really paying attention. And it's just, there's so much to see. Again, there hundreds of different species that grow in our area, and a lot of those, the best time to see them is right after a fire. And so I hope that just this one slide alone maybe makes you want to get out there and explore a little bit after a fire. I do want to mention wildlife just for a second. I think it is amazing that in that early post-fire period, the first few weeks, the first couple months, you don't see a lot of wildlife. I mean, the first non-plant life that I saw was ants, and that was in that first, like literally after the fire, and the day after the fire, you'll see ants coming up out of the ground. They can survive the fire just fine. But what's so cool is that you'll see, like, this is late flowered Mariposa lily that came up after the fire. And it's like suddenly there are all these different insects that are there. Now, a lot of them make sense, right? You've got bees and butterflies, they fly into the area. But as soon as those start to occupy this post-fire environment, then suddenly you have crab spiders and other predatorial bugs. So it's neat to see this process unfold, and in a quicker time frame than you might expect. This is probably my favorite photo I've ever taken of an insect and a flower. It's just like, it's so perfect. This little ladybug is getting like smeared with pollen by this Fremont star lily. It's like you can see many hundreds of thousands of years of evolution on display here, which is pretty cool. And then bees and guys that try to look like bees. They try to fool you into thinking they're bees. This is a bee fly. But if you want to see a wide diversity of native bees on display, go into the post-fire chaparral. It is incredible. I've never seen anything like it. It's just really neat. Butterflies as well, pale swallowtails. You will see these for the first couple of years, especially on white eardrops. This is something, just one of those weird observations that I noticed. As you get pollinators, you get things that eat those insects, quail and other birds, lazuli buntings. If you're a birder, I've never seen more lazuli buntings than I did in the first growing season after the cave fire. And that's just, they're attracted to the area by all these different native bees and other pollinators. Also quail. This is just 7 months after the fire. You already start to see coveys of quail kind of moving through the area, which is pretty cool. Southern alligator lizard, I was really surprised to see this lizard, especially because they're usually associated with kind of thick leaf litter, sort of moisture areas, shadier areas. But this guy was there 5 months after the fire, just hanging out, let me get really close. This is actually a selfie of me. You can see me in its pupil reflection there, which I thought this is probably my favorite selfie that I've ever taken. I don't take a lot of them. So this is pretty neat. I really enjoyed seeing this guy. Fence lizards, especially the second year after the fire and onward, you'll see a lot of these guys. They hang out on burned stems, on rocks. They're just doing their thing. This guy was like giving me that stinky, side eye while he was doing push-ups on a greenbark ceanothus stem. And then deer. This is probably the one people talk about the most in terms of post-fire, wildlife. But yeah, you definitely see deer in post-fire chaparral, and they will eat just about anything. It seems like this one was munching on ceanothus and morning glory, and just did not care that I was there and taking lots of photos and video of it. Kind of snuck up on me while I was just hanging out. So pretty cool. This is my last one. I just want to give you a perspective. This is again from the air, and this is this is actually one I showed in one of those very first photos where the fire just kind of stopped in the chaparral. this is what it looks like 3 years. This is about right now. This is what it looks like. So this is unburned chaparral, and this is what burned in the cave fire. So still a long way to go before it looks like this, but it's doing really well. I just, it's been a joy to watch this process unfold. And I hope that, you've learned something and find this interesting enough that you want to get out there and maybe explore the post-fire environment. So I'll take any questions now.
Bryant, I must say, that's amazing. The passion you have for this and what you've done is phenomenal. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. I'll just check the chat, see if anyone had any questions. I wasn't really watching the chat. Yeah, is wild cucumber
Bryant?
also called? Oh, go ahead.
Sorry,
Selby?
yeah, Bryant, I love that presentation. That was really pretty stunning. I noticed you were recording it. Are you willing to like share a link so we could share that with friends?
That's up to
We're
the Fire
actually
Safe Council.
recording that. So yeah, it'll be on our website,
It'll be on the
Fire Safe Council website.
Yeah, Sheldon, all of our presenters, if you go to our webpage up top, it says featured presentations, and we record all of our presentations and put them there.
Joan, you had a comment?
A comment and a question. During the Alisal fire, I was driving to a press conference and saw the Whittier fire area. And so it had mostly come back. And so I talked about resilience a bit, and people get kind of discouraged. But what you've done with this amazing presentation is really explain to us the processes by which resilience happens in our area, and I'm really smitten. I hope you're putting this in a book. It's extraordinary. My question really is this: it was always my impression that if we had fires that were too hot, that it would destroy seed banks and maybe destroy those burls that you described and make it much more difficult to come back. But your point was mainly that it was too frequent. So I wonder if you would talk about that.
Yeah, I don't think heat is really the concern. It certainly can kill things. I mean, definitely you can get resprouting species that if their burl burns enough, they can have problems. But I think, I mean, like with the ceanothus, a lot of the ceanothus, or most of them, their seeds are germinated by heat stimulation. They need high heat because essentially they have like this little pore on their seed coat, and it has this, it's like a waxy material that sort of melts away. Basically the pore like opens up, and that allows water to get in, and that's what stimulates germination. So hotter is not an issue. I would say frequency though is the problem, and it has a lot to do with those obligate seeders because they really need time, and it varies, right? So you'll definitely see some species that they grow to maturity quicker than others, and they start putting out seed. But some, like some manzanitas, there was an interesting study several years ago that was about, I think it was Moro manzanita, which is up in the Morro Bay area. And it wasn't just that they needed time to mature and start producing seed. They also needed time for those seed banks to really replenish. And so they were finding that even like 40 years wasn't quite enough time. Now this was in like maritime chaparral, where fire is even less frequent than in other places, just because it tends to have coastal fog drip a little bit, and it's just slightly different. But you need time for maturity to occur so that you can actually produce seed, and you need time for those seed banks to replenish. With the resprouting species, they can definitely deal with more frequent fire, but only to a point, because each time this happens, they're using a lot of their carbohydrate stores that they've built up. They use a lot of that to put up that growth very quickly after the fire, and if it occurs again too soon, they've depleted those stores and they're not able to resprout quite as well. So I would say, the other issue is, there's some thought that if you don't have enough time and you don't get enough of like a leaf litter layer to develop, fires may not be hot enough to stimulate certain species, the ones that require heat. So that's the other aspect of time. But yeah, too frequent fire is a concern for chaparral for sure, and it's a primary concern, especially as you go south. Like San Diego County has had really overly frequent fire, and large areas have converted to non-native grasses for these reasons. But we don't have that quite as bad up here. But you know, as climate change occurs, I think it can become more of an issue for sure. And thank you for what you said in the
Oh,
beginning.
thank you for
Jen.
the new word, epicormic.
I hope everyone learns a new word from my presentations, at least one. Epicormic is a great one.
Ethan, and then Renee.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. That was a really interesting and beautiful presentation. I learned a lot, and I've actually been spending time out at Arroyo Hondo doing time lapse since the fire out there and the Alisal fire, and learned a bunch about species I've been seeing in different phases. So thank you. And I'm actually curious about some of your techniques. If you have posts in certain places where you're going back and getting those different time delayed exposures, or what you're doing. And lastly, I'd love to catch up sometime about this stuff, but also I just appreciate the time you spend out there, because a lot of that stuff you can't get it, especially the wildlife stuff. It's just sitting there, things come out, you notice things in the details, and it's really a gift to us that you spend so much time out there. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. This was just a snippet of my 11,000 photos, mostly from the cave fire alone. So I spent a lot of time out there, and yeah, probably most of those photos will never be seen by another human. But I would say in terms of technique, those are trade secrets, Ethan, and I can't reveal those. That's proprietary information. But actually, it's just for me, I didn't put posts or anything. I just found like landmarks, rocks usually. I would say if anyone else wants to do these things, especially with time, like trying to make time lapses, a couple things I learned: definitely find a place that's easily accessible from a road or trail, because it does not take long for it to become very difficult to walk into chaparral that was once like mature chaparral with no trails. And then it's like, yeah, after the fire, it's super easy to walk around. You got to be careful because you don't want to step on seedlings and stuff. And the soil is very unstable and rocks are unstable. I fell, I broke a camera lens. I hurt myself, you know, it definitely happens. So I would also urge caution. Safety is an issue. But yeah, I would find like rocks that were very distinguishable, and go back to those rocks, stand on that rock and try to use the same settings I did the last time. But yeah, it's just hard. It's hard to lug around a tripod and do stuff. So yeah, I just kind of was winging it most of the time, and it turned out all right for a lot of stuff, but a lot of other things didn't work very well at all. And if you're trying to, Ethan, if you're trying to take time lapses of like new growth, and you want to, maybe you want to document like a greenbark ceanothus from its resprouting, and then like you want to get it as it's getting bigger and bigger. The problem that I kept finding was that I was taking really close photos, like almost like macro photos of that resprouting, and then you have no way of, it's like within a few months you can't even get your camera into that same spot because there's now vegetation occupying that space. So just keep that in mind. But yeah, I love your work, and I'm kind of jealous of all you get to do, and I'm excited to see what you've been doing in the Alisal fire.
Thanks. Last thing I was going to say is I appreciate that you're presenting something that is builds an appreciation for the role of fire, and as a part of the nature that we already appreciate, and that we're not just needing to be motivated by fear to address fire in where we live. So it's really nice in that too.
Ethan, so Renee, Leela, and then Rob.
Bryant, I just wanted to thank you for that very excellent presentation. It was astonishing, and I learned a lot. We also have the California flannel bush, or Fremontia, here on our property, and California redbud, which I have observed. They seem to respond in fires, preferring the inordinate heat or fire to resprout. And I think there are some plants that actually won't resprout unless there's a fire. Is that correct?
Yeah, you're getting into a complicated question about resprouting. There's still a lot of question about like, why did resprouting as a process evolve? A lot of this it didn't actually even evolve in response to fire necessarily. It was like it's like these not vestigial, it's I don't know how to describe it, but a lot of resprouting ability evolved in a time when there wasn't a lot of fire, and it had to do with being in these unique forest types where plants, like, a part of the canopy would open up, and a plant would take advantage of that by putting up some new growth, and that became a very useful thing to have, that ability when fire became much more dominant on the landscape. But yeah, it's hard to say whether or not, I mean, I definitely see resprouters that will resprout not in response to fire. Like if you see anyone who does trail work, right? If you do trailside brushing, you know that it can take a lot of times that you cut the same chamise or something before that chamise actually would die. And so it's often, I don't know. I think there's some complex like plant chemistry that happens that is in response to biomass being lost above a certain point. And so it's just like things happen, and you're getting into like complicated questions that I don't know the answers to, but
Thank you, honey.
yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Hila?
Oh, you're muted. Oh, there
Yeah.
you go.
Oh, hi. Thanks. Amazing talk. I'm fascinated. I feel like I learned a lot today too. I'm a climate scientist, and I'm interested in climate and how climate could play a role in wildfires. And my question for you is that because you explained that the frequency of fires is important, right? Well, my question for you is, are there any climate stressors that could reach a tipping point for all this process that are important to be concerned about, to investigate? I'm saying that because we may have a more heat waves right after a fire, or extreme events or extreme rainfall. What is important? I want to understand, because I want to focus my research on this as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think probably the one thing I didn't mention as much, like with the cave fire, is that it just happened to be in an area that has gotten really good rainfall, even in relatively dry years, like 2020, 2021, not good water years at all for our area. But if you look at where we got a lot of precipitation consistently, it was San Marcos Pass and just east of San Marcos Pass in the San Ynez Mountains. So I think decent rainfall, like where you don't get consecutive years, especially right after the fire, where you're getting very little rain and it's really hot. I think that is important for the success of this regrowth process. And there have definitely been some studies that have looked at like the desert side of the mountains down south in San Diego County, like in the San Jacinto Mountains and the peninsular ranges just in general, where on the desert side, where you have this more kind of desert, this chaparral that's definitely more arid chaparral, not quite as dense, it's a little different. But you can see where, because of post-fire weather patterns and climate patterns, there's not as much regrowth. And so the desert might be shifting a little bit up into those spaces where it was previously chaparral. So in those cases, it's like, it's like a different type conversion that's happening. It's a little different, but yeah, I definitely freaked out a little bit because you kind of become attached to these places. And so like in the cave fire, if you remember 2020, we had a really dry January and a really dry February, like unusually dry, scary dry. And I just thought I thought all the seedlings were going to die. But you got to remember that like the resprouters, especially, they have deep roots that they're tapping into, groundwater. They're not as concerned with that, what's happening year to year. It's more like a long, they can suffer from chronic drought more so than acute drought. The seedlings can definitely have problems with acute drought, like right after a fire. But even those, I just was amazed at how many ceanothus seedlings survived. I mean, it was like incredible. But and that's been fairly consistent even in areas like in the Thomas Fire, where in Ventura County, where it wasn't wet at all. I mean, it was like really dry after the fire for several years and still had pretty good seedling growth. But yeah, I would definitely say precipitation, post-fire precipitation patterns and heat stress can definitely be a concern. And it's certainly something that should be studied more. Thank you.
Rob, be the last question.
Yeah, that was great, Bryant. That was awesome. If anybody wants to see this stuff, the road's a little sketchy, but it is open. If you go up Refugio, you can see the alisol regrowth. It's pretty crazy because I wouldn't stop on the switchback zone. You'll know what that is when you're going up it. But once you get past that zone, there's a couple places right before you leave the burn. It was the alisol was kind of strange. It stopped as it backed up the slope against the offshore wind. It kind of stopped through some suppression action, and so you actually have unburned above it, which is unusual. But there's a really good spot where you can go in there. It's actually my family's property, but there's a Forest Service parcel that you'd park at. If you have a USGS quad map, you'd know where it is. And so it's public land. So you can go in there and there's a huge patch of Refugio manzanita, which is like a really rare manzanita. And you can see where it's resprouting. And then you can go just a little bit off the edge and you're in the ceanothus. And you can see where it's just going crazy. And then the morning glory vines are just like, it's nuts. Like it's hard to walk through it because it trips your boots when you try to walk through it.
Totally.
Yeah, it's really cool. And unusually, of course, the amount of rain we had, it's like insane, the growth right now. It just went through the roof just in the last couple of weeks. And then a couple observations. So we have had a couple classic examples. They're very small. So Bryant's right, like down south, it's really, really prevalent where you have type conversion. If you go like into Riverside area and then like Interstate 10 going up through Cabazon and then looking at the San Bernardino National Forest, you can totally see where all that's kind of left are the resprouting chaparral and then surrounded by grassland, because they just get this feedback loop of too many fires. And the obligate sprouter stuff gets kind of big and it's okay, it can handle it, but this obligate cedars are done. We had an example of that in Santa Barbara County on the Frontcountry. The Gaviota fire was in 2004. It was a very hot wind-driven fire, total full-on stand replacement, just like what you've seen in this presentation. And then it grew back really vigorously and was mostly ceanothus, like very much dominated by ceanothus, because it was just essentially burning the right where the grasslands transitioned into chaparral, where you go from the clay soil to the sandstone. And a couple years later, we had a wind-driven fire, and it's the only way it could have burned. Like if you don't have a lot of wind, you're not going to get fire spread through immature chaparral. It's just too wet and green. It's really not that flammable. It takes many decades for chaparral to suddenly become super flammable and self-sustained combustion just based on temperature and humidity and slope inputs. But when you add wind, you can actually get fire that burns through 1 or 2 year old chaparral. In this case, I think it was 3 years old, maybe 4. Mariposa, I think, was 2007, I believe, maybe 2006. And wind-driven Gaviota sundowner, hammered fire. It started in the grass and it kind of skipped up onto the edge of the chaparral that was, like 4 year old brush. And it just ripped through it in these really bizarre patches. And to this day, I know where they are because I hoofed it up there and mapped them all. We did a map class for all of our firefighters on the existing fire line. And so I'm really familiar with, I must have walked that perimeter 100 times. And so to this day, I always look up the slope, and sure enough, all that regrew was the obligate sprouter stuff. So you had some of the lemonade berry, I'm just using common names, but like the lemonade berry and toyons. And then it's surrounded by grass. And now you're starting to get some like buckwheat kind of stuff. Sagebrush is starting to come in, and a few of the ceanothus starting to kind of try to come in from the margins. And then interestingly, a couple of those reburned on the alisol. A little bit of it, the margin of it got hit by the alisol. So it is possible to happen here. It would probably be something really dominated on the Frontcountry if you had back-to-back sundowner fires. Fortunately, our sundowners always kind of burn from the top to the bottom, which kind of limits their sideways spread. The problem in Southern California is the Santa Anas are so huge and widespread that you could have a Santa Ana fire like in San Diego or Riverside, and it just goes over mountain, over range, down into valley, and on and on and on for 20 miles and create a 20-mile burn through a previous burn scar, which you got type conversion happening over a massive area. So it's super problematic. And then the last thing I know, after the Zaka, because of the drier backcountry gets like, I don't know, a third amount of rain as the front country. There are areas the Zaka didn't regrow as well as some people hoped. And I hiked a lot back up in Manzana area, and I saw a lot of grass all over the place that had previously been chaparral. The chaparral is not as thick back there, so there's more open space between it. I think there's just the grass got in there with the wind and just took off. And I know that was a big concern with a lot of ecologists, was the Zaka restoration was concerning. But yeah, great presentation. It's really cool.
Thanks for all that. Yeah, a lot of interesting info. I mean, the Cedar fire in San Diego County, a lot of that reburned in the witch fire just 3 years later, and that caused some serious issues. I was actually going to ask you, I noticed that a chunk of the Sherpa fire reburned in the Alisal fire, and I don't know what the actual burn patterns were, but because you know, like the perimeters overlap, but I didn't know how much actually really burned within that overlap zone.
It was really kind of what we call, wildland firefighters call it, a dirty burn. So it kind of, I think it'll be less damage to the regrowth than like if it had slicked off. I walked a bunch of it. It kind of just got in, and you know what it burned? It burned the dried morning glory, and primary specer, because that stuff's still there for a while. It takes a while for that to mat down. And it just skunked its way through that. A lot of the Ceanothus was okay, but I haven't been back in there. It would be really fascinating to go in it, because you'd know now it's been 2 years, 2 years.
Yeah.
You would know if that Ceanothus died from the heat exposure, right? Because it is kind of susceptible to, like, if it totally singes out, it's going to probably die. I don't think it'll be as bad as we think, but there probably will be right on the edge where the hot flame front hit it. You'll probably have a 20 to 30 foot strip, maybe, where it'll probably be like what you're talking about, like a strip that has to grow back over many generations to finally fill back in.
Okay, Ethan, you're on it, right? Go check out the overlap zone between Alisal and Sherpa.
You know, actually, I was out there when I was shooting during the Alisal fire. I ran into the ranchers that are, you know, that there's that one tin barn right near the highway. So they had overlap in those fires as well as the Real fire, they were saying, in part of their property. So yeah, it could be interesting, but I think it's up behind the hills there. I'm not entirely sure where.
The best place to get up into it would be, you could come in from La Paloma Ranch, if you could get permission to go up in there, or through El Cap. You'll have to hike up El Cap, up the Bill Ferris Trail, and then cross back over in the public land to get over there. Because otherwise, the easiest way would be go up Las Flores to the oil facility. The other way you can see it, there is some areas, if you came in off of Camino Cielo, you'd have to hoof it for a long ways. There's a dozer line that comes off a big outturn, and that dozer line was put in on the Sherpa and then again on the Whittier. So you'd also get to see what happens with a dozer line, how it grows back. Some cases it's fine, other cases it's horrifying. What star thistle and gross things like that. So you'd get to see that, and then you'd see where Sherpa and then Whittier hit, which was a 1 year apart deal, which barely moved. I mean, the Whittier was so hot, it was unbelievable when it hit the Sherpa, but there was barely anything growing on the Sherpa, and so it kind of really didn't. It's crossed in like about, you'd measured in feet, like 5 feet. But then if you walked down that ridge, it would take a long time, and you'd have to walk back out or somehow walk out to El Cap. But you would then cross into where the Alisal went into the Sherpa, and you'd get to see it. And then maybe one last comment to follow up with Joan's question about heat. I do remember there was a lot of concern about the Thomas, about how hot it got, and there was some of the Forest Service geologists and fire science folks were looking at the soil, and they were using terms like hydrophobic, I think is what they called it. And that is a concern. I don't think their concern was over whether it was going to regenerate. Some people were concerned, but clearly it regenerated quite well. But it was more about like that first rain would then cause the potential for more erosion. And so that might be a concern. I think that's more of of a factor of like slope. I mean, honestly, the slope was really what drove the debris flow, the massive, steep, gnarly slope. The only other issue I know of with how hot a fire burns is not really chaparral, it's more conifer forest. So exclusion of fire in conifers then causes huge crown fires that, I mean, you're always going to have crown fire in timber, but we have just very excessive crown fires that are burning all of the canopy and very rarely going understory and burning in a cooler burn. So I think that's more of the issue. The Los Padres has these island, they call them like sky islands, like they're like island forests of big cone spruce and certain pines and firs, and those would take a pretty gnarly beating from fire. But I think chaparral, it's every single burn plot I've ever walked on years after in the Santa Barbara County has been pretty well regenerated, with the exception of some of the Zaca. And I think the Zaca it's getting drier back there.
Great. Thanks, Rob,
Mhm.
for all that info. Bryant, again, thank you for an awesome presentation, and your photography is amazing.
Thank you.
You definitely
Appreciate
should put that in a book, no doubt, or at least. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Well,
Yeah, thank
move
you
on.
all.
Thank you. So let's do